Even a century after it started, it can be hard to shake off that impression that World War I was fought by white men from Northern Europe. But you only have to look at the contribution of men from the colonies and the dominions of two of the main warring parties to realise just how untrue that is. In 1914, Britain and France had spheres of influence that stretched right across the globe, very useful when recruiting men to help fight a war. India, still a major colony of the British Empire, had well over 1 million of her men recruited as soldiers and labourers to the war effort. Britain's dominions, the self-governing territories such as Canada and Newfoundland, Australia and New Zealand, all made very significant contributions. Even the tiny islands of the Caribbean provided much-needed manpower. The idea of a global army was something the British were keen to promote, although always careful to portray themselves as top dog. The French pursued a similar policy, with over 500,000 colonial troops recruited during the war, many of them serving in Europe. They drew in tens of thousands of men from their territories in West Africa and in Indochina. And the French strongholds in North Africa, all were plundered for their human resources. There were well over 4 million non-white men mobilised into the European and American armies during the war, and the effect on the Western Front was astonishing. It transformed those parts of France and Belgium into nothing less than the most diverse place on the planet. In the trenches, men who'd grown up thousands of miles apart suddenly found themselves in the closest proximity. They were living and fighting and sleeping side by side. And behind the front line, in the military-industrial zone of camps and hospitals and billets, there was an even greater mixture of cultures and races and religions. This was multicultural, diverse Europe, but decades ahead of schedule. This is the Chatri Memorial on the South Downs. It's a classically Indian monument here in the middle of classically English countryside. And there's a reason why it's up here. Just over there is the city of Brighton. And during the First World War, 12,000 Indian soldiers who'd been wounded on the Western Front were treated in Brighton's military hospitals. And for the Sikh and the Hindu soldiers who didn't make it, who died of their wounds, this spot was where their stories came to an end. These were men who'd come from the villages of India. They'd travelled 6,000 miles across oceans to fight in the world's first industrial war. And this is where they're remembered, in a field in southern England. The India Corps played a critical role in World War I, and they paid a heavy price for that. Between 80 and 90,000 of them were killed, fighting in Europe and beyond. But it was the fighting in Europe, on the Western Front, that was the most bewildering. This, after all, was an army that had been trained for life on the frontier. They were used to putting down tribal rebellions and pushing back border incursions. But now they found themselves in an industrial war. And to make matters worse, many of the white British officers who spoke the Indian languages and knew their culture were killed early on, leaving them under the command of men who knew nothing about them. The high casualty rate of the war highlighted one very important cultural difference. In the Indian army, once a soldier had been wounded in combat, he had fulfilled his duty. The idea that he would be treated in a hospital and then sent back into the war was completely alien. But that's exactly what happened, and much of it took place here in Brighton, where thousands of Indian soldiers were nursed back to health in improvised hospitals, the most eye-catching of which is this one, the Royal Pavilion, which was George IV's former seaside home. It wasn't the biggest of the Indian hospitals, but it was the most important because it created this image, this vision
that went around the world of Britain as a culturally sensitive power that was looking after its Indian soldiers in the most difficult of times.
That's just what the British wanted. There's no doubt there was a good standard of care, much better than in the hospitals back in India. But even at the time, the British authorities realised the PR value to its empire of the image of colonial soldiers being afforded a touch of Eastern-inspired luxury.
Whenever we tell stories about war, we have this urge, this tendency to want to find the positive, redemptive stories, the little rays of hope in the middle of all the suffering. But the reality is that for most of the men who had their wounds tended here in Brighton, the war wasn't over. They were only here for a few months or a few weeks, and at the end of that time, they were sent back to the Western Front or back to Africa or to Mesopotamia to keep fighting anywhere the empire needed them. This was just one stop on their global war.